screaming for help, a young man named Frank Linebacker came to the rescue of sorts. And there's going to be, we may never be sure exactly what happened, because there's written word that such and such took place, and a few days later written word that a different set of events took place, and people's memories over the years clouded a little bit. But it appears, from an interview a couple of days later, that Mrs. Brunner was overcome by the smoke and had to be helped down by way of a ladder. Now, Mr. Linebacker ascended that ladder, got into the room with the children, and found them out of their beds and on the floor. And he immediately, now one written excerpt says he carried them down bed and all, but an interview with him specifically a day or two later said, I took the first child to the window and dropped, I think he said him, to men below. I don't remember much about the second child, but I must have dropped the second child the same way. Then I noticed that someone had taken away the ladder. I made my way to the roof. How, I don't know. Firemen saw me on the roof and got me down off the back via a ladder and took me over to the Croghan house where they revived me. Okay? Now, what's happening here? Here's the fire department. We have a hydrant there. We have the old pump cart. Okay? Croghan did have hydrants, double hydrants. They were put through in 1910. The man on Fox News tonight did not mention the hydrants, but I did specifically give him that information this afternoon. So they tapped off the closest hydrant here on the corner. Now, Croghan Reservoir is probably 4 miles to the east. And this water line was put in 1910, and the water came down at a pressure of 120 pounds per square inch. That was too much for the plumbing of 1912. So a mud valve, a splitter, was put in up across from Croghan Recreation Park on the Gershwinville Road. And it sent 70 pounds of pressure to the village and 50 pounds to the river. Now, when this fire started, the fire chief, Dr. Paul von Zerlschofen, directed this man on horseback, and this is a reproduction by Joe Schlier, graphic artist, wonderful reproduction, to go out to that valve and close it to the river and send all the pressure to the village firemen. And the gentleman went out and turned the valve the wrong way. Sent all the water to the river and none to the village. With the meaning of trying to save the children and lack of water, the fire began to take on the character of a conflagration. Now, 2 weeks ago, 100 years ago, the Titanic went down. And just as a short anecdote, one of the survivors, one of the lookouts for the Titanic, to do it, looking out for icebergs at 10 o'clock that fateful night, and gave the word, iceberg straight ahead. He got on the first lifeboat to be a rower. They thought that everyone would be saved, so he and the other lookouts made it through. Now, they interviewed him later, and he said, the binoculars, 2 sets of binoculars the lookouts were supposed to have, were locked in a cabinet, and the man with the key to the cabinet had gotten transferred to another ship. If he had had a set of binoculars instead of his naked eye, that whole incident would have just been a close pass-by. So what can go wrong will go wrong. They got the water turned back on, but the fire was going into the next building, over here, and it was crossing the street to Proulx's store. They immediately, the fire chief, Dr. Proulx, sent word to Lowville, we're going to need help. Lowville loaded 1,500 feet of hose, a chemical, got aboard the Lowville and Beaver River Railroad, and did the 12-mile trip in 18 minutes. A record for that time, by train. Now you can see, I told you there's kind of a story for each of these people. Here's Mr. Linebacker, and here's the men below. One of the children is being brought here by the butcher to what may be the grieving mother or a friend. And he has the second child in his arms, about to drop that child, and then he will make his way to the roof. Okay? We'll go on to the next one. This is later in the afternoon. We can see the fire progressing down the street. And before I get to that, let me tell you that, like I said, I had those 3 audio cassette recordings of the people who were there. Mrs. Irene Verkler Kelly, Irene Verkler at the time, was working at the post office. This will go back for me, on the far end of the building. And she said, someone came by hollering fire. And I said, where's the fire? And he said, it's in your building. Oh my. So she made her way upstairs, must have done by a different stairwell. And she and her mother found photos, photo albums, family keepsakes to take, to save. And another fireman came along and he said, get what you can and get out. We can't save your building. Well, she said, I had things to do. She was the assistant postmaster and she had to put things away before she could do that. But she was 26 years old at the time and a graduate of Syracuse University, which was unusual for females of that era. Minnie Verkler Farney, was a young wedded lady living up near the diner, and she had a tiny baby, and she put the baby in the carriage, she said, to go downtown and see what all the commotion was about. And she said embers started coming right in to the carriage. So she turned around and went back home to mind her own business. Angeline Norris was a 10th grader at St. Stephen's School, perhaps beginning to be called Father Wales. My father was 14 years old. He was 7 weeks in this country and struggling to learn English, or the nuns were struggling to teach him English. I don't know if he wanted to learn English or not. But he told me how this was up behind the church. School was behind the church. How any children from this end of the village, they walked all the way down the Beaver Falls Road to the Black Creek and followed the creek with the kids down around the fire. And anyone who lived up on the other end, Angeline Norris for one, John Murphy was a student at the school, and he said they took us up to the ballpark. And they kept us at the ballpark until things calmed down and parents showed up. And etc., etc. So it was quite a day in Croghan. The fire continues to make its way. It gets so hot, so heated, that where the firemen connected hose to hydrants, they often could not get back to turn that hydrant off. So they lost all that water pressure. And at times, not too far into the afternoon, they only had water firing maybe 15 feet as a result of lack of pressure. People are scrambling to save things. Mrs. Morilli handed a solid silver serving set out the window to be saved and never saw it again. It was saved by someone, I suppose. We'll see photos of kitchen stoves and things like that in the street. Some other things that were taken around the back street, tried to be saved. And I interviewed Homer Gerard, maybe a name familiar to many. He worked as an elections inspector into his 90s. Homer was a fireman. And he told me, he said, you know, we saved a lot of things and we put them out over on the back street. But he said people came from away and looted. And I kept that in the back of my mind. And when we were interviewing Liz's grandmother at 100 years old, I said, Mrs. Kelly, I was told that there was some looting. People came along in the middle of the night, midnight, etc., from away, and she said, I don't think they waited that long. They were there quick and they were early. Oh well. Okay, so we're coming up the street. The suggestion is to use dynamite. Jim Morilli told me that his uncles carried the dynamite. Morilli's store handled dynamite for loggers, for making logging roads, and for breaking up log jams in the river, things like that, moving boulders to make a road. And the suggestion was to use the dynamite to level the building and the path on each side of the street. And maybe they could stop the progression like that. But no one wanted to give them permission to do that. They wanted to try to save it. So that went by the way. You can see men on the top of Goslin's roof. Those are Loudville firemen. Remember the 4-foot diameter standpipe of water? Baslin's own water system. The Loudville firemen wet horse blankets and kept those horse blankets wet up on Baslin's roof as the embers dropped on them and saved his building. He lost a small repair shop, probably behind the residence just below. And over here you can see Loudville firemen. They're on this end of the village. The Croghan firemen are down in the center. They're trying to save the Central Hotel and pouring water over onto the Parquet House. But the building they're on is on fire below them. And their fire foreman, Charles Ryan, rushed in and ordered them off the roof. And a few moments later, the building collapsed. Now here we are at St. Stephen's. You can see the religious outfits here. Nuns, priests, the minister provincial of the Franciscan order was in the village that day on his way to Ogdensburg. And they're carrying things out of the church, and they're offering all sorts of prayers, novenas, etc., if the church can be saved. The pastor of the church, Father Joe Buzzin, I was told this by Father Anthony years ago, who heard this from Brother Bernardine. Some may remember his name. He was here for decades. He was here as a brother in 1912. And he told Father Anthony that the pastor, Father Buzzin, Joe Buzzin, brought the monstrance out that they used for benediction, and he stood in front of the church and he made the sign of the cross with that monstrance, and he told the people not to worry, their church would not burn. So whether that worked or not, as the fire progressed, by 6:30, the Central Hotel was down, everything in its path was down, both sides of the street. I'll go over it with you as we get to the devastation. And the north breeze that was around during the day, not a terrific wind at the start, a brisk breeze out of the north, the day much like today in the 50s, ebbed. The wind that accompanied the heat of the fire stopped, and people were at the church with their garden hoses, etc., bucket brigades, and they managed to save the church as the embers were hitting it. Jen Burkhardt was a 7-year-old girl living on Convent Street, and she's told me that afternoon men were pouring cement behind the Miller house for the horse barn or whichever, and she and a couple other little girls were over there watching the men do that. And the church bells began to ring just like today, 2:30. And the alarm of fire was spread. And those working men sent those girls home. She said, I got back to my mom's on Convent Street. They took me out to Grandma's. They didn't want me near the fire. But when I went home that night, she said my mother had been doing her curtains on curtain stretchers in the backyard, spring cleaning, and those curtains were just a mess from burning embers. And that's all the way over Convent Street, beyond the church, and they were seen much further out than that. So that's how this traveled. This is the evening. The initial estimate was anywhere from 250,000 to 750,000. It came out at probably around 400,000 to 500,000. This is Clement and Julia Grunner. This is the Saturday Globe on May 4, 1912. And photos of the two children. If they're accurate, they could be file photos. I don't know for sure. This is the man named Linebacker. You'll see that the name is spelled a little differently there than we know today, but I believe that's just a newspaper man's spelling. And the Loudon Fire Department, Chief George Sherwood, Foreman Charles Ryan. The Croghan Meat Market, the ice house survived. Through these photos, you'll see a number of ice houses where the ice covered by the sawdust, etc., survived, but the buildings survived. Marillie's store, with the chimney in the upper right foreground. It was estimated the Marillie's loss was $50,000 in 1912. The entire loss, if we're looking at $500,000, The insurance aggregate was approximately $125,000. So the average was 25%, the insurance figure. This is Ed Radigan's general store. Michael Verkler, and we believe Dr. Laurentine Rochelle, who was Baslin's cousin. She was a female MD, and also, like I said, Sarah Simonette, also a female MD. We had two at the turn of the century, unusual. You're looking across the Opera House. I think I'll give you a better one at the Opera House that remains. And Monument Park, that's Baslin's family monument. And then next to it is Merle's chimney. Now Baslin's monument cracked. And Bob Lynch, Judge Bob Lynch, told me years ago he was a school student, Father Leo's in the 1920s, and he remembers playing behind the new Opera House at that time, and parts of the statue of the angel and some of the other pieces of that monument were behind the Opera House. They've been replaced. The heat caused them to crack. That's looking from the west side of the street to the east. Monument Park on the left, the Opera House to the center, Radigan's General Store steps to the right, and the old fire hall behind was William Waterhouse blacksmith shop. This is taken from the north side of Merle's store looking up toward the church. What the morning of April 30th, 1912 was all a thriving, self-sufficient village. This is what it looked like the next day on the east side of the street. Now, some of these photos were brought in by students when I was teaching local history, and I thank all of them and those who helped put this story together. And I also welcome former students who hated history then, but think it's time to probably find something out about historical anecdote. We're looking across at the east side of the street, and there's the Opera House. If you look closely, way down in the far back corner, there's a jail cell. And there were many people locked up in that jail cell through the years, but fortunately no one was there on this particular day. That's the remains of the Opera House. Now we're looking from the Central Hotel, the last building. This is about where the Maple Museum is, looking down toward the meat market and across the street. That's way down in the far background left is the horse barn for the Croghan house. Again, looking across the street. Okay, so some of the photos, like I said, were brought in by students, and we made Lowell Gensel, the audiovisual person at Beaver River, made these slides for us. And just not too many years ago, Scott Sellers, Scott here tonight, Scott found a number of negatives in the attic of his house, and took a look and stopped. He made some prints of them, and that's what these pictures here are that are less professional. An amateur photographer made these photos. We don't know who. But you can read the caption there, Ruins of Croghan, New York, looking east. Now the ends are backwards, and usually the numbers. Now this is a more professional photo by Mandeville, looking up toward the church. And these were usually postcards, very often made into postcards. I believe we see an ice house up there that was probably with the Central Hotel. Looking down toward the Colligan House on the west side of the street. It says looking east from the depot. Well, it's actually looking north. From the Baslin area in the center of the road, look